At first, it looked like a catastrophic mistake. When Ukrainian forces pulled back north of Pokrovsk, observers across the world interpreted the move as abandoning one of Donetsk's most strategically significant cities. That interpretation was wrong. What Ukraine actually executed was a deliberate, calculated sacrifice. Surrendering Pokrovsk to neutralize Russia's southern army and position itself for something far more consequential. The gamble has delivered results. Ukraine has achieved a sweeping victory in Zaporizhia. The fall of Pokrovsk, what it actually means. On the surface, the situation in Donetsk looks like a disaster. Pokrovsk and the settlements surrounding it are now formally under Russian control. AMK Mapping's X account confirmed that Russia's recapture of Rodinsky completed its takeover of the entire Pokrovsk agglomeration. Rodinsky, alongside Pokrovsk, Mirnorod, Novorodivka, and Hrodivka, all fell after a battle stretching over a year and a half. According to the Kyiv Independent reporting from February 16th, Pokrovsk's collapse followed a Russian escalation north of the city aimed at encirclement. That pressure whittled Ukrainian defensive capacity down to essentially a single unit, the 7th Corps, before the withdrawal order was issued. The fall arrived roughly 6 months after Putin had publicly declared the city's capture as the centerpiece objective of Russia's 2025 summer offensive. Originally, Pokrovsk was supposed to fall while summer was still underway, giving Russian forces time to consolidate and prepare a winter push deeper into Donetsk. That deeper push never materialized. Pokrovsk held on far beyond what any realistic assessment would have predicted. This should be a moment of triumph for Putin. It isn't. Why Russia's Pokrovsk gain is essentially hollow. As analyst David Axe outlined in a February 18th column for Euromaidan Press, the territorial gains Russia has made around Pokrovsk and Mirnorod, located approximately 100 kilometers northeast of Huliaipol, do nothing to advance Russia toward its actual strategic objectives in Donetsk Oblast, the twin cities of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, situated 50 kilometers to the northeast. What Russia has done is consolidate control over cities that Ukraine was holding primarily to bleed Russian forces dry. Tens of thousands of Russian soldiers perished, taking a city that they were already most of the way to capturing, and which does not open the door to what Russia needs next. Ukraine's withdrawal from Pokrovsk was a deliberate strategy, not a defeat. Russia was given its Pyrrhic victory because Ukraine had already identified far more important objectives elsewhere. Pokrovsk was converted into a prolonged killing field, and as Russia was consuming its manpower fighting for it, Ukraine quietly redirected its focus to the southeast. Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia counteroffensive. The counterattack that Ukraine launched in the southeast as Russia was consolidating in Pokrovsk has produced the fastest territorial advances Ukraine has achieved in 2.5 years, a pace not seen since the summer 2023 counteroffensive, according to France 24. Axe explains the mechanics. As Ukraine's attention appeared fixed on Pokrovsk through the end of 2025, the Zaporizhzhia region was left comparatively exposed. Russia's pathway into that region lacked the heavy fortifications that defend every route toward Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. Russia's Dnipro group of forces had been exploiting this, using infiltration tactics with a 5-to-1 manpower advantage to inch toward Zaporizhzhia city, rather than launching large-scale assaults. Ukraine's response was surgical. In early February, Ukrainian forces rushed south toward the Huliaipol sector. Airborne and assault brigades attacked simultaneously from the west and north, striking directly at Russia's 36th Combined Arms Army in Pokrovsky. The Russian Southern Army was completely blindsided. Positions collapsed rapidly. One concrete example of Ukraine's sacrifice: the 425th Assault Regiment, which had been engaged north of Pokrovsk until February, was redeployed to participate in the southeastern counterattack. Ukraine understood that pulling this regiment would accelerate Russia's advance in Pokrovsk. The calculated trade-off was that the regiment became a central contributor to the operations that have since liberated enormous stretches of territory Russia believed it had secured. By February 16th, Ukraine had recovered 201 square kilometers, approximately 78 square miles, of occupied territory in the southeast. That figure roughly equals the total territorial gain Russia had managed during its December push toward Zaporizhia. Most of the recaptured land sits approximately 80 kilometers east of Zaporizhia city. Territory that Russia had been infiltrating through gray zones is now fully under Ukrainian control. Ukraine continued pushing after that. UA Wire reported on February 18 that Ukrainian forces advanced an additional 4.5 kilometers across 3 sectors near Huliaipol, extending gains already made along a 20-kilometer stretch of the Oleksandrivka-Huliaipol axis. Advances were confirmed near Taranov, Verbova, and Vishneva. Ukraine's Southern Defense Forces spokesperson, Vladislav Voloshin, confirmed that active reconnaissance operations were underway to locate and eliminate remaining Russian infiltrators, cementing Ukrainian control over liberated territory. Starlink's role. Ukraine had assistance in all of this, and it came from an unexpected direction. In early February, SpaceX made the decision to cut Russia's access to Starlink by blacklisting the unauthorized terminals Russian forces had been relying on for drone operations and battlefield communications. BBC News Russian reported on February 10th that this single decision sent shockwaves through Russia's military. Starlink had allowed both sides to exchange information and coordinate operations rapidly. With Russia's access severed and Ukraine's terminals whitelisted and fully operational, a significant asymmetry emerged overnight. Russia has been attempting to build substitute communications infrastructure, but nothing available to it replicates Starlink's effectiveness. Ukraine timed its southeastern push to coincide with this Russian communications collapse. In that context, the Pokrovsk sacrifice reads even more clearly. Ukraine drew Russia's attention to Donetsk, then struck southeast against infiltration units that had just been stripped of their most effective coordination tool. The Starlink cutoff is not temporary. Putin's forces hold Pokrovsk. But the push deeper into Donetsk that must follow will proceed without the system that has underpinned Russian battlefield coordination throughout the war. For reference, Russia has lost over 1.25 million soldiers since the invasion began, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance. That figure will continue to grow, more slowly and at higher cost, without Starlink. Why Zaporizhzhia had to be defended. The strategic rationale behind Ukraine's counteroffensive goes deeper than territorial recovery. Zaporizhzhia is one of Ukraine's most critical energy regions. Beyond the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, already under Russian occupation, the region contains the Dnieper hydroelectric station and the Botievo wind farm. Together, these 3 facilities supply 25% of all electricity generated in Ukraine. Allowing Russia to advance freely toward Zaporizhzhia city would have handed Putin effective control over a quarter of the country's entire power supply. Novaya Gazeta reported that Russian battlefield advances during the winter had been steadily increasing pressure on the region, much of which Ukraine has now reversed. Zaporizhzhia city itself had been edging toward the range of Russian artillery. Voloshin confirmed that Russia had been transferring airborne units from Kherson and Dnipro into areas around Zaporizhzhia, consistent with preparations for a concentrated assault on the city during spring 2026. Ukraine's response, reversing Russian gains and reclaiming ground, creates the buffer needed to build defensive fortifications before that assault materializes. The territory recovered gives Ukraine the space and time to replicate the layered defenses that made Pokrovsk so costly for Russia. Every meter of ground Russia retakes from this point forward will need to be fought for again, burning through manpower and equipment before any serious push toward Zaporizhzhia city can even begin. Armed forces of Ukraine. Colonel Roman Svitin, speaking to Novaya Gazeta, assessed that capturing Zaporizhzhia city remains nowhere close to achievable for Russia in 2026. The city, which housed over 700,000 people before the February 2022 invasion and may still have up to 500,000 residents, presents an urban warfare challenge on an enormous scale. Ukraine's entire approach is oriented around buying time. The longer it can delay and attrite Russian forces, the stronger its eventual defensive positions become. What Pokrovsk was always for. Pokrovsk's true value to Ukraine was never primarily as a logistics hub. That role had already diminished considerably by 2025. Its value was as a killing ground. Since Russia's 2025 summer offensive, the city and surrounding settlements have functioned as a systematic attrition machine against Russian forces in Donetsk. The numbers reflect this. Colonel Volodymyr Polevy, head of communications for Ukraine's 7th Rapid Response Corps, told the New Voice of Ukraine as recently as February that Russia was sustaining approximately 6,000 casualties per month in the Pokrovsk sector alone. And that figure covered only one defensive zone. Axis Trench Art column documented 100,000 Russian casualties in the Pokrovsk area between January and early October 2025. The New Voice of Ukraine separately reported 15,000 Russian deaths across 6 months within the 7th Corps sector exclusively, with additional losses elsewhere. Pokrovsk consumed and shattered the Russian force assigned to take it. What remains of that force is now supposed to tackle Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, objectives that form part of what Medusa has described as the Donetsk fortress belt. Putin is demanding Ukraine surrender this belt at the negotiating table. He is doing so because he knows what capturing it militarily would cost. United 24 Media has provided insight into the belt's construction. The Donetsk region has been transformed into a dense, multi-layered network of fortifications extending for miles, positioned predominantly on elevated ground, offering clear sight lines for artillery and drone operators. Barbed wire, minefields, anti-tank obstacles, and high-density drone coverage occupy the approaches, forcing any attacking force through a series of kill zones before it even reaches the fortified cities. Several of those cities are larger than Pokrovsk. The Institute for the Study of War estimates that capturing the full fortress belt could take Russia until 2028, at minimum 2 more years of sustained catastrophic losses. Pokrovsk, in this framework, was the opening act. Surrendering it was not defeat. It was an invitation for Russia to walk into a kill zone that dwarfs anything it has faced before. The peace talks dimension. There is a final layer to Ukraine's Pokrovsk calculation, its impact on the negotiating table. By allowing Russia to take Pokrovsk, Ukraine gave Putin a victory that he had already publicly claimed months earlier. That is not leverage, it is embarrassment. Putin cannot enter peace talks and acknowledge that he misrepresented Pokrovsk's status when he declared it captured in December. Ukraine, by contrast, arrives at negotiations having just liberated approximately 80 square miles of territory in the southeast. That is tangible, demonstrable leverage. As Russia pushes for Ukraine to formally cede occupied land, Ukraine can point to the southeast and argue that Russia cannot even retain the territory it already holds. Notably, Ukraine's most significant recent gains came precisely as envoys from both countries were preparing to meet to discuss peace terms. The broader picture is this. Russia's southern army has been severely degraded by what Ukraine has engineered. Its Donetsk forces are exhausted. And in Zaporizhzhia, Ukraine has bought itself the time and space to build the defenses that will make 2026 potentially the most damaging year for the Russian military since the invasion began. Ukraine gave up a city it had already bled Russia dry defending, and in doing so may have put itself on a path to strategic victory. Beyond all of this, Ukraine has also been transforming its drone capabilities into increasingly lethal instruments of war. operating what amounts to a continuous, around-the-clock strike program that is already degrading Russian forces significantly. That story deserves its own detailed examination, available in our separate coverage. Subscribe for continued in-depth analysis of what is actually unfolding in the Ukraine war.